Okay, so we are Yud Omid Aleph 10a. We are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines down from the box, from the top. Sorry, 9 lines down from the top.
Yeah.
First one on the line is Kamashmalan. Okay, so last time you may remember, last time we saw four potential scenarios of a sukkah on top of a sukkah. Our default position was a sukkah on sukkah. We're actually machlokas in the Mishnah. The Tanakama, the first opinion of the Mishnah, said that sukkah agabe sukkah halyona kasher v'tachtona pasula. A sukkah on top of a sukkah, the top sukkah is kosher, whereas the bottom one is posel, because you can't have two sukkahs. We said basukot teishu shiva shamim, which means only one sukkah. So the top one will be kosher, whereas the bottom one is posel. However, said Rabbi Yehuda, im ein de yaron be'elyona hatachtona kasher. However, if the upper one doesn't have tenants, then the lower one is kosher. And we said the Gemara, Rashi says the Gemara will explain exactly what that means, and we will get to that in a moment. But we then saw that I can't remember who actually brought it. It doesn't actually say towards the bottom of Tesomah base. Gemara says that sometimes you can have a sukkah where both are kosher, a sukkah on top of a sukkah where both are kosher, where both are posel, where the lower one is kosher and the upper one is posel, and whereas the upper one is kosher and the lower one is posel. And it all depends on certain factors as to whether the upper one is giving more shade than sun, or more sun than shade, whether it's within 20 amos or whether it's above 20 amos. So having said that actually it's not as black and white as we originally said in terms of a sukkah on top of sukkah, the lower one being posel. There are actually scenarios where it could be kosher. So says the Gemara. Gemara asks now a question. So we are 9 lines down from the top of 10a. Yeah, says the Gemara. Kama yehei ben sukkah l'sukkah, v'tahei tachtona pasula. How much does there need to be? How much of a gap does there need to be between the upper sukkah and the lower sukkah that would posel the lower sukkah? Evening, Paul.
Evening, Rabbi.
We just started on Yud Omid Aleph, 9 lines down.
Yeah.
Kama yehei. So the Gemara asks a question. Kama yehei ben sukkah l'sukkah v'tahei tachtona pasula. What is the minimum gap there needs to be between the upper and lower sukkahs that would render the lower one posel? If you look lower down the page, Rashi's quite out of sync with where we're up to. Where are we? Actually, yeah, it's the final of the narrow lines in Rashi here. V'kama says Rashi, v'kama yehi mafsik ben schach l'schach. Interesting. Rashi clarifies for us. What gap do there need to be between the schach of the lower one and the schach of the upper one? V'tavsul tachtona mishum sukkah tacha sukkah, that would invalidate the lower sukkah on account of being a sukkah on top of a sukkah. So lo nema chad sukkah, where at what point would we say this isn't one sukkah, that we cannot almost go back to our concept of bittul. At what point are we no longer able to say we can nullify the upper sukkah because it has such minimum dimensions between the schach of the upper sukkah and the one of the lower sukkah? At what point do we say we can no longer nullify the upper sukkah, and it would be considered to be a valid sukkah in its own right, which would then invalidate the lower sukkah? So we're going to have 3 opinions. So says the Gemara. I just have to go back up again now to see it. Yeah. So Amar Rav Huna. First opinion is here. Amar Rav Huna. So Amar Rav Huna tefach. Rav Huna says a tefach, as long as there is roughly a 6 to 8 centimeter gap between the schach of the upper sukkah and that of the lower sukkah, then the lower sukkah will be posel. Why? It says Gemara, because we see when it comes to ahalei tumah that tents, dwellings which there is tumah in, spiritual impurity in, we say there has to be, the dimensions are of a tefach. If we look at Rashi, again, the first of the wide lines of Rashi, middle of the line, tefach. So it has to be at least a tefach gap between the schach of the upper sukkah and that of the lower sukkah for the lower sukkah to be possible. However, says Rashi, any less than a tefach between them, then it's considered to be one schach. Okay, so what is this defining feature, says Rav Huna? It is a tefach. Why? Because a tefach is a significant dimension when it comes to the consideration of tumah. So, for example, if somebody is in a house where there is a dead body or parts of a dead body, we know a dead body is an avar tumah. It is a first source of tumah. It makes anything in that house tameh. Yeah, as the Torah says that Adam the person who dies in a tent, anything, anybody or anything which is in that house or that tent becomes tameh because they are in contact with it. Says the Gemara, and you'll see here we've got an asterisk and a bracket and an asterisk. It says the Sanya, taught in the Bryce. Actually, again, you see in the margin it says Sarachloma Desnan. It's a Mishnah, not a Bryce. Desnan, piece of Mishnah material, and it's in Ahalos, chapter 3, Mishnah 7. Says the Mishnah there, Tefach al techach barum tefach. If you've got a beam, a board of wood, a plank of wood, which is a tefach wide, a tefach long, and a tefach thick, maybe it's a tumah, then it spreads the tumah beneath it, the chotzes bifnei tumah, and acts as a barrier to any tumah that, and acts as a barrier for the tumah, meaning the tumah cannot penetrate through it above. So anything above that beam, anything sitting on top of the beam, which has a thickness of a tefach, it wouldn't become tameh. But anything underneath it would. More goes on and says, "Avar pachus mirum tefach lovet mevi v'lo cholet." However, if this beam is less than a tefach high, then it neither spreads the tefach to anything below it, nor does it act as a barrier to anything above it. So interestingly, there's almost a leniency and a stringency. So if it's a tefach wide, long, and high, then anything underneath it is tameh. Anything above it, it acts as a barrier to prevent it becoming tameh. But if it's not a tefach thick, then anything beneath it doesn't become tameh. But anything above it, it doesn't act as a barrier, and that would become tameh. Let's look at Rashi. Rashi spells it out for us. End of the first of the wide lines in the Rashi. Tefach al tefach barum tefach. Anything which is a tefach long, a tefach wide, and tefach high. Mevi es tumah v'chotzes mifnei tumah. It spreads the tumah underneath it and acts as a barrier to anything above it. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Says Rashi, there is no source of this in Torah. This is a halacha that was transmitted to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Aval pachus mitefach lo mevi v'lo chotzes. However, if it's less than a tefach, then, as we said, it doesn't spread it, but nor does it act as a barrier. So it says Rashi, lo mevi es ha-tumah, it doesn't spread the tumah. Im tumah tachas rosho echad, v'kedim tachas rosho sheni. If you've got a source of tumah at one end of this beam, and you've got some vessels, some kelim at the other end of the beam, v'kora arucha v'rachba tefach, and this beam is a tefach wide and a tefach long, then it's now fit to transmit the tumah. Lo maisi mishum deleke rum hefsak tefach. Yeah, we're not dealing here with where it doesn't have the height of a tefach. Whereas if it doesn't have that height of a tefach, tefach memenu ulukarka, between that and the ground, v'lo says im yesh kli al gaba. So if there is a kli, a vessel sitting on top of this thin board, agaba keneged hatuma, which is intervening between the tumah and the utensil. Afilu al-rakia tamei. The tumah penetrates through this thin board all the way up to the sky. To tumah ritzutza she'ein la oel tefach bokas v'oler. It's considered to be like a squeezed or crushed tumah, and the tefach when it's less and it doesn't have a tefach which is holding it back, and therefore it just ascends all the way through it. Okay. So says the Gemara. So that's one opinion, that if there is at least a tefach between one schach and the other schach, then the lower sukkah is possible. If there's less than a tefach, then the upper schach is considered almost subsumed into the lower schach. It's considered to be one set of schach, and the sukkah is the lower sukkah is kosher. Just look at Tosfos on the top left-hand side. Amar Rav Huna tefach. So Tosfos says. So Rav Huna said that the minimum measurement is a tefach. Says Tosfos, Afa Gavdal Kaman Perek Hayashan. He says even though later on in Perek Hayashan on Daf Chaf Beis Omad Beis Amrinan Chavut Rami Hachalo Shaykh. And there the Mishnah over there, Gemara over there on Chaf Beis Omad Beis talks about an idea, a type of schach where you've got boards or reeds, planks of wood of at least a tefach, but they are set out in a way. So you've got a board and a gap, a board and a gap, and a board and a gap. And then above it, within a tefach of it, you've got, again, board and a gap, but they are in between. So this is the lower one and this is the upper one, like that. So it's filling in the gaps. Yeah, but obviously it's not actually physically filling in the gap because there is an airspace between them. The Gemara there says we have a principle of, we have it previously, this idea of good achis, which we can extend down the walls of something. This is a similar idea. This is called chavit rumi, which is almost like we lower it and spread it out. So although physically they are not side by side and therefore closing up the gap, we can say actually we can pretend that we can notionally say this lowers down and joins together to complete, so it reduces the air gap, the airspace between it, and that's sufficient. So you might be able to say that here. Why don't we say that about the upper schach here? Just say, well, if it's within certain distance of it, let's just say, well, it's considered to be filling in the gaps between the lower one and the upper one. Says Tosfos, now Tosfos just says that it's not applicable here. He doesn't explain why it's not applicable here. He just says it's not applicable here. So that it just heads off any particular question, which is, we're going to see later on that perhaps you could have said that the same thing would apply. He says, no, it doesn't apply here. Okay, so that's the first opinion. Rav Huna says a tefach is the defining factor. Carry on in the Gemara. Rav Chista. Here we are. Here, it's always in this line. Rav Chista, v'Rabba Rav Huna, Amri. So they both say Arba. No, they say no. 4 tefachim is the minimum that's necessary for the lower sukkah to become possible. 4 tefachim. Why? Because we don't find any significant area less than 4 tefachim. Now you may remember quite a way back we talked about a house within a chotzer, and we talked about with Eruvin, whether that house is included in the eruv of the chotzer, is considered to be part of the chotzer, whether they would need to contribute to becoming part of the chotzer or not. We said the defining factor is 4 tefachim. Anything less than 4 tefachim is not considered to be of any significance. Again, if you look at Rashi, It's about 5 lines down in the wide lines of Rashi, beginning of the line. Shlo matzinu makom chashuv lios rishus la'atzmoi. We don't find any domain that has significance in its own right when it's less than 4 tefachim. Lo karmelis v'lo rishus hayachid pachos me'arba'a. Neither a karmelis nor a rishus hayachid is considered. Nothing will be considered to be a karmelis or a rishus hayachid if it's less than arba'a. Now, a karmelis is something which is neither a rishus hayachid, a private domain, nor a rishus harabim, a public domain. It's neither one or the other. It doesn't have the features of either, meaning it's not big enough to be a rishus harabim, nor is it enclosed enough to be a rishus hayachid. However, it is at least more than 4 tefachim, because if it was less than 4 tefachim, it wouldn't be a karmelis, it'd be known as a makom patur. And that's significant. So, for example, interesting halacha, makom patur means an exempt area. It's so small, it has no significance whatsoever. So even though it's in the public domain, it has no significance. So, for example, if you find yourself in the street, a place where there's no eruv, and you suddenly realize that you've got something in your pocket, you're carrying something, yeah? What should you do? What is the halacha? So actually, what you're not allowed to do, the halacha is, you're not allowed to carry something, dalad amos b'rishus harabim, 4 amos in rishus harabim. Okay, so about 6 foot. So as long as you don't do 6 foot carrying something, you're okay. Obviously, the Rabbanan is less than that, but the Oraisa is 6 foot. So what do you say? If inadvertently you find yourself carrying something, what you should do is you should look for a makom patur within Dalad Amos and put the object down in there. Because by placing it down in there, you've not put it down, because what's the issue? It's akira v'anacha. So the malacha of carrying is picking it up in one domain and putting it down in another domain. As long as you haven't done both of those, you haven't transgressed the Torah prohibition of hotzah, of carrying. So let's say you've done akira, you've picked something up in a private domain, you then got out into the public domain, realized you can't put it down where you are, so you can't stop, you need to keep going. And what you need to do is, with the Dalad Amish, you need to find a makom patur, an area less than 4 tefachim, and put that thing down on it. Because then you've not put it down in a rishus harabim, you've put it down in an area which is not considered to be anything whatsoever. So you've not done the full act of akira and hanacha. So, for example, I don't know, something like a letterbox. Yeah, a letterbox I think would be less than 4 tefachim, right? Possibly. So put it down on there. So anything small, like a low wall or something like that, put it down on there. Okay, that's just a side point. So what we see from here is, though, Rashi is telling us, let's see, did we finish the Rashi? No, we didn't finish Rashi. So a karmelis, which is neither rishus harabim, rishus hayachid, and a rishus hayachid itself, has to have at least 4, otherwise it's not considered anything. As it's Kedama b'Yisir Shabbos, we see in Gemara and Shabbos stuff Zayin Omid Aleph. V'hachinami lav rishus la'atzmohi le'ekuri sukkah tachas sukkah. So here also, if the upper sukkah is less than 4 tefachim high, and even square, I suppose, then it wouldn't be called a sukkah in its own right, because nothing less than 4 tefachim square is considered to be a rishus, a domain in its own right. And therefore, even though you've got this tiny little sukkah above your other one, it's not considered to be anything, and therefore the lower sukkah would be kosher. Okay, so that's the second opinion. 4 tefachim. Gemara continues. Where are we? Yeah, beginning of the next line. Here at the beginning of the line. Sorry, Ushmuel Amar. Ushmuel says, Asara. He says, no, it has to be 10 tefachim. If the upper sukkah is 10 tefachim high, if the schach is 10 tefachim above the other schach, then the lower sukkah would be possible. You can see the little hanging base there tells us that's how we pass. We pass like Shmuel. However, we're now going to challenge Shmuel. There's no Rashi on this. Let me just check. Yeah, there's no Rashi there. And actually, let's look at the Tosfos. Look at the second Tosfos on the left hand side. Shlomat sinu makom pachos medalet. So Rav Huna said there has to be at least 4 tefachim. Hanle inyan rishus hayachad v'karmelis k'teparish v'kuntras. So yes, we said in relation to rishus hayachid and a karmelis, as Rashi explains, uli inyan gova. What about the height? Rashi doesn't seem to address that issue. What about the height of it? He says nami ashkechan bereish chaloin liachshev kepesach. Yeah, so we see that also in relation to Gemara and Eruvin talks about it, that 4 tefachim high also would consider to be kepesach, like an entrance. Okay, so also it's about the height as well. So not only the width and length, but also height as well. Okay, so let's go back in. So Shmuel says 10. Ask the Gemara, my time at Shmuel. What is Shmuel's reasoning that the minimum height of the upper sukkah, which would postle the lower sukkah, is 10 tefachim? So says the Gemara, k'hakashera kach pasula, because he holds the principle of that which makes something kosher is the same thing that will make it postle. My hakshera ba'asara, just as the minimum dimensions of a kosher sukkah are that it has walls of 10 tefachim high, so too would that dimension postle the lower sukkah. Meaning, if the upper sukkah has walls of a height of 10 tefachim, and therefore the schach is 10 tefachim above the lower schach, that would postle it. Okay, look at Rashi, middle of the line of Rashi. Kachshera kach basula. Mushum shtei sukkos, pasla kara, and that which makes it kosher also makes it posel on account of there being 2 sukkahs. The Torah would posel it. V'chi leis ba be'elyona hechshe sukkah lav sukkahi v'lo pasla, and therefore the corollary of that is if the upper sukkah doesn't have the dimensions of a kosher sukkah, meaning it's not at least 10 tefachim high, then it's not considered a sukkah, and it doesn't postle the lower one. Okay, says the Gemara. So having said that, Shmuel is telling, so according to Shmuel, the defining factor is whether the upper sukkah has 10 tefachim or not. If it does, then it postles the lower one. If it doesn't, then the lower one is kosher. However, says the Gemara, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda said, Im ein deyorin ba'alyona hatachtona keshera. Said Rabbi Yehuda that if there are no tenants in the upper sukkah, then the lower one is kosher. Says the Gemara, my ein deyoron. What does that mean? There are no tenants. Ilema deyorin mamish. Does it mean to say literally tenants? Meaning, if there are people in the upper sukkah, that postles the lower sukkah, and if not, then it doesn't. Says Gemara, Ilema deyoron mamish, atu deyoron kaigarmi. Does it really mean? Are you meaning to say that literally having tenants in the upper one is what causes the lower one to become postle? Look at Rashi. Inema deyorin mamish she'ein ba'adam. You're going to say that it means literally with tenants, if there aren't any people there, atu deyorin garmi mikol makom sukkah tacha sukkahi. It would still be, nevertheless, it would still be a sukkah underneath the sukkah. Says the Gemara, elalav. Well, surely this is what it means. My ein deyoron kol she'eino ru'eya ledira. Does it not mean when it says ein deyoron that there are no tenants. What it means is kol she'einu roya l'dira. Not literally that there are tenants in it, but what it means is that anything, that there aren't tenants in it. Rabbi Yehuda said, if there are no tenants in it, then the lower one is kosher. It doesn't literally meaning if it's empty. What it means is if it's a sukkah that is not fit to have tenants, meaning it's too small to have tenants. So the defining factor is not whether or not it has tenants in it. Rabbi Yehuda say, well, if it doesn't have tenants in it, then it's kosher, meaning if it does, it would be possible. No, it must mean that if it's not fit to have tenants in it, that's what, then the lower one would be kosher. Let's just have a look at Rashi. Yeah, elalav she'enu roya l'dira ve'echidami d'lo gova yud miklal d'tana kama. Yeah, v'kasha l'shmuel midrabanan. Rashi almost spells it out for us in the Dibra Maskil. Yeah, what would that mean? What would something which is not fit to have tenants in actually mean in practice? Meaning it's less than 10 tefachim. Yeah. Says the Gemara, first of the wide lines in the Gemara, Vehechidami de logova asara. And then we find that it's less than logo. It doesn't have a height of 10 tefachim. Now, what's the issue here? Says Gemara, Michlal. From that we can imply the Tanakama Sava Af Al Pi She'ena Roila Dira Pasula. That would imply. Look at the Mishnah again. Can you go back to Tesomad base? Look at the Mishnah right at the top of the page. Said the Mishnah, Ha'ose Sukaso. Can you see it? Ha'ose Sukaso Tachasa Ilan. Ki'ilu Asa B'socha Bayis. Okay, that we saw before, right? A person makes a sukkah underneath the tree since they made it in their house. Sukkah al gabe sukkah, and if they made a sukkah on top of the sukkah, ha'elyonu kasher tachtona pasula. The upper one is kosher, the lower one is posel. Rabbi Yehuda says, im ein diyorin be'elyona hatachtona kasher. Says Rabbi Yehuda, if there's no one in the upper one, then the lower one is kosher. Now, the fact that Rabbi Yehuda says anything implies that he disagrees with the Tanakama. Tanakama said, you've got one sukkah on top of the other, posel, end of story. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll agree with you if the upper one has tenants, or it's big enough to have tenants in it. But if not, then the lower one will be kosher. Now, what does that imply about the Tanakama? If Rabbi Yehuda says, as long as the lower one, as long as the upper one is not fit for tenants, meaning it's less than 10 tefachim, the lower one would be kosher. That would imply that Tanakama disagrees, because Rabbi Yehuda clearly disagrees with Tanakama, because that's why he quotes him. Which would mean, what does Tanakama hold? That to Tanakama Sava afal pisha inu dira pasula. It would imply that Tanakama was of the opinion that even if it's not fit to accommodate people, meaning it's less than 10 tefachim, still the lower one would be possible. So yeah, that's what you're really trying to suggest. How can, therefore, it's a problem with Shmuel? Because Shmuel would seem to me, according to Rabbi Yehuda's explanation, in disagreement with the Tanakama, and presumably we paskin like the Tanakama, not like Rabbi Yehuda. So how can that be? How can we suggest that what Shmuel was saying was that the upper one is less than 10 tefachim, because that puts him in direct contradiction to the Tanakama of our Mishnah. So says the Gemara, Ki atza Rav Dimi Amar. When Dimi came, meaning when Dimi came from Israel to Bavel, he said, Amri Bamarava. They said in the west, meaning in Israel. Im eina taftona yechola lekabel karim uksusos shelayona hataftona kashera. What they meant, what Shmuel really meant was this: if the upper one, when Shmuel said, if the upper one cannot accommodate people, then the lower one is kosher. It meant if the lower one isn't able to, if the upper one isn't able to support the weight of cushions and pillows of the upper one, meaning it's so flimsy, its schach is so flimsy that the smallest amount of weight on it would collapse. Then hatachtona kashera. Then the lower one is kosher. Why? Because the upper one is uninhabitable. It's not. It doesn't have the minimum basic, not dimensions, but permanency of a sukkah at all. A sukkah's got to at least be able to support its occupants. I'll just look at Rashi. Yeah, says Rashi, Ki alta Rav Dimi Amri B'Amarava, Hai ein roi ledira T'ka'amar Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda said that it's not fit to be inhabited, Lav b'she'ein gavoa. He wasn't talking about its height, its dimensions. Because then, according to Tanakama, it would also be kosher. But we're talking about where it's not healthy enough and strong enough to be able to support the weight of the upper one's pillows and cushions. Relation tachtona, and sleep on it. Tachtona kashera. Then the lower one would be kosher. Yeah, and they goes on to say, "My high time according to this reason of Shmuel. According to this reason of Shmuel, that just as what makes it kosher makes it possible for kiven de elyon loy chazir lemidabel. Since the upper one is not fit for dwelling in, since the lower one isn't able to support it, then it doesn't posel the lower one. Yeah, the minimum requirements of a sukkah is it can support its occupants. If the upper one can't support its occupants because the lower one isn't strong enough to support it, then it can't. That which would make it kosher is also that which would make it posel. Since it's not got enough to make it kosher, it therefore also doesn't have enough to make it posel. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's go back in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, hold on a second though. And end of the third of the wide lines. Miklal, according to this though, we can infer the Tanakama Sava afal pi she'ena roi lekabel pasula. Oh, hold on a second, no. Because even according to that explanation, it would seem that you're making out that the Tanakama would say, even if the upper sukkah isn't able to support even if the upper one isn't inhabitable because the lower one isn't able to support the pillows and cushions, nevertheless, it's possible. Because if you look at the Mishnah, there's clearly a machlokus between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, according to our second explanation, is saying that if the upper one isn't able to be supported by the lower one, because the lower one is so weak, then the lower one would be kosher. But that would imply that the Tanakama would disagree with that. And that would suggest that the Tanakama would say that even if the lower one is unable to support the upper one, the lower one would still be possible. And how can you say that? That just doesn't make any sense. So answers the Gemara, Ikebanayu. There is a distinction between these two cases. So we'll agree on this, that the Tanakama Rabbi Yehuda will agree that if the upper one is less than 10 tefachim, then the lower one is kosher. And if the upper one is uninhabitable because the lower one is unable to support its weight, the lower one is kosher. When do they disagree? Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Igabanayu, says the Gemara, where the lower one is at a push able to support the upper one. meaning it's just about able to do it. Yeah, it's probably, it's bowing. The schach of the lower one is bowing under the weight, but it's not collapsing. It can just about support the weight. Says Rashi, Mishani Ikabanehu, the Rabbanan Savre Kiva the Yachol Lekaba B'Dochek Shem Sukkah Ala Yona. That Rabbi Yehuda would say, even since it can just about, even at a push, support the weight of the upper one, and the upper one has a Shem Sukkah, it's considered to be a valid Sukkah, and therefore it would postle the lower one. The Rabbi Yehuda Sava, whereas Yehuda was of the opinion, given to Leika Tashmisha Ledei, love Shem Sukkah, whereas Rabbi Yehuda would say no. Since it can't really, it can't really be used at all, because it's so close to collapse, it's just unusable. Love Shem Sukkah Allah. The upper one does not have the designation of a sukkah, and therefore the lower one would be kosher. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so they're disagreeing over a very small point. Yeah, they agree over the major points, which is if it's 10 tefachim, everyone agrees the lower one is possible. If it can't support the weight of the upper one at all, then the lower one is kosher. Where they disagree is that if it can just about support it, the Tanakama will be of the opinion if it just about supports it, well then it's a sukkah. The upper one's a sukkah, the lower one's possible. Whereas if you just say no, it's not really suitable for inhabitation, and therefore even though it can, just about support it, we don't consider it to be the upper one to consider a sukkah, and therefore the lower one remains kosher. Okay, that brings us up to the next Mishnah.
And can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Just from my understanding, Tana I get. What's Tana?
Tanakama?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Tanakama is what we always refer to as the first opinion in the Mishnah.
Okay.
Tana means teacher,
Yep.
and Kama means first.
Okay.
Okay. So you won't actually see it anywhere. Sometimes you see it. End of the third line, you see Tanakama.
Yeah.
Tanakama always means the first opinion, often unnamed in the Mishnah. The anonymous first teaching of the Mishnah is called the Tanakama. And we generally go according to Tanakama.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, let's look at the Mishnah. Next Mishnah. Okay, cool. Says the Mishnah, Peirus alea sadin mitei hachama or tachtea mipnei haneshe. You have a kosher sukkah. We're back to one sukkah now. Okay, one sukkah, and what you do, someone spreads a sheet over the top of it in order to shade it from the sun, or they put a sheet underneath the schach in order to catch any falling leaves, or shipiras al gabeha kinuf pisula, or third case, they spread out a sheet over a four-poster bed, pisula. In all those cases, it's possible. Now, actually, interestingly, the Ritva says it's slightly inexact language, because Psula would apply to the first two cases. If you were to put a sheet over the top of the sukkah because of the sun, to shade it from the sun, the sukkah is possible, because you've used, we'll see what she says, you've used possible schach. You can't use a sheet of schach. It's cotton kabel tuba. Similarly, if you put it underneath, again, it's possible. The third case, whereas you've got a kosher sukkah, the schach is kosher, it's good sukkah. All you've done is you have set up a four-poster bed with a covering, and you're underneath it. Mm-hmm. There it says psula. Any acts you do in the sukkah are possible, meaning you would not fulfill the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah, of sitting in the sukkah, if you're underneath this. So the sukkah itself remains kosher. Any action you do is possible. Okay. Mishnah goes on. Aval pores hu al gabe niklati hamita. However, if you were to spread it over a two poster bed, then it's kosher. Meaning what you do underneath it is kosher. We'll see why. Let's just look at Rashi. Says the Rashi, Haneshe. So you spread a sheet underneath the schach in order to catch the leaves. Shlohe alin v'kismin noshrin al shulchano. You do it in order that the leaves or the pine cones or twigs, whatever they are, noshrin al do not fall onto your table. The sudden dava hamakabel tumah. But however, this sheet is something which is susceptible to tumah because it's been made into a kli, something usable. As we'll see in Yud Aleph Omid Aleph, this postles the schach. Okay, and what's the second case? The third case, or shepiresh al gabe kinuf, or you spread it on top of a four-poster bed. Rashi says, "Kloma afilu loy pirusum ipnei haneshe elonoy ala mitato." Rashi says an interesting point here. Even if you've not done it in order to protect you from falling debris, rather as a nice way of decorating the sukkah, and you've put it on top of your bed. So what is this agabay kinuf, says Rashi? Hein dalad kundasin, the dalad ragle hamita. There are four posts which come up from the feet of the bed, the gvohim, and they are high. Umaniach kolunsos mizelas there al gabehem, and you run boards or beams between them. So you've got these, obviously, everyone knows what four-poster bed looks like, right? So four big poles come up from the four corners of the bed, and then joining the four posts are beams going all the way around. And then, Paris, Aleihem, Sadim, and then you spread a sheet over it. And if you're distance from the schach, then the reason here, Mifsala, the reason why here it's possible is not because you've done something, you've added something which is Makabal Tumah to the schach, because there's intervening things. Basula, why? Why is it possible here? Because you're not sitting under the sukkah. You're not sitting under the schach. There's something which is you're in a tent. You're in a tent in a sukkah, and that is acting as a barrier between you and the schach. Aval, carry on in Rashi. Aval pores hu al gabe niklute hamita. However, you put it over the beams of the bed. She'enan ela shnaim. Here, there's only two. Vein yotzim be'emsa mita echad l'morosh oseha. So you've got two, one at each end of the bed, two posts, and you've got a beam running across the top of it. So like this, right? So triangular.
Yeah.
Let's have a look back in Rashi. So running down the middle of the bed. One from its head and one from its foot. And you run a beam from one to the other. And then you spread the sheet over it. This sheet, rather than staying flat, obviously, now slopes side to side. And since at the top, at the apex, where they join, there isn't actually a tefach of material, therefore it's not considered to be an ohel. Yeah, like again, that's what we said about this idea of tumah. We said the beam has to be a tefach, yeah, for it to be considered to be something of actually insignificance. So here, since there isn't a tefach of material running on the top, it's not considered to be an ohel, and therefore being underneath that would be absolutely fine. Doesn't seem, it's not considered to be. It's almost the sheet is actually an extension of the walls. Yeah, it's just an extension of the walls, which they come to an apex above your head, but it's of no dimension and therefore insignificant. It's still considered as if you're underneath the schach. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, says the Gemara. Let's do a little bit of Gemara try and get to the bottom of the page. Says Gemara. Amar Rav Chista. Rav Chista says, Lo shanu ela mipnei hanesher. So when we talked about the second case of running a sheet underneath the schach, that was only in order to catch the leaves. However, if it's in order to decorate the sukkah, so if you put a sheet up, you put like those, you sometimes see in these places and like in marquees, they decorate the inside of the marquee with this very nice gathered material, right? Purely for decoration. There's no practical purpose for it. Purely decorative. So here also, you spread sheets underneath your schach to decorate the sukkah, not to catch leaves, merely purely as a noi, as a decoration. Says Rav Chista, kshera, that will be kosher. Yeah, look at Rashi. The schach remains as the thing which is protecting you, not the sheet. Sorry. Sorry, the other way around. Only because it's not acting as a protection for you is it okay? Is it okay as decoration? What was the issue with the case in the Mishnah? Since you've put the sheet there to catch things falling through the schach, that is now acting as a protection instead of the schach. And since the sheet is makabel tumah, you've made the whole sukkah posel. Aval linoyos, says Rashi, 4 lines up from the bottom of the page. However, if you put it only up there not to get active protection, but as decoration, ein shem schach aleha, it doesn't take on the definition of schach because it's not acting in a protective way, purely as a decorative way. V'kshera, and it's kosher. V'yesh mefarshim, time the basula, and those explain the reason why, if it was there to catch all the leaves, it's possible. They would say because you got two layers of schach, and again we've said you can only have one layer of schach. And that's impossible. Okay, that's a separate point. Let's leave that for a moment. Let's just go back into the Gemara. So according to Rav Chista, the Mishnah only was teaching only if you place the sheet there to protect you, is it possible? Whereas if you place it there to decorate it, it's kosher. Says the Gemara, end of the line, pshita. That's obvious. It's none. The Mishnah itself told us the reason. It said if you put it there to protect you from the falling leaves, then it's possible. Now, of course, if you put it there for other reasons, it would remain kosher. So why didn't Rabbi Chapper tell us that? Says the Gemara, who are din ta'afilin, because you might have thought that even if you put it there for decorative purposes and not for protective purposes, it would also be possible. And you just might have said, well, the reason why the Mishnah used the example of to catch the leaves is because that's the normal reason why you put a sheet there. That's normally why people put something there to catch the leaves. But it might have been, the Mishnah meant, any time you put a sheet underneath your schach, whether it is for protective reasons or for decorative reasons, it makes the sukkah possible. Kamash malan, it would come to teach you, no, that if it's there for decorative reasons, then the sukkah is kosher. That's what Rav Chista was trying to tell us. It says the Gemara, and let's say there's a support for what Rav Chista said from what we learn here. in Gemara in Beitza, sochacha kihilchasa. The person puts kosher schach, has kosher schach on their sukkah. V'itra b'karamin uvesadinin hamusuarin, and then they decorate it with like colorful cloth and like two types. I don't know, two types of Rashi says here. Ma'aseh oregs, like woven material, from big date sivonin, for example, like color dyed clothing, shukorin, overwritten. So some types of different types of materials people decorate it with, right? And Gemara goes on. V'talaba egozim shkedim afasakin v'rimonim, and then they hang from it like we do. Nuts and almonds and peaches and pomegranates. I don't know why they shoot peaches, but anyway, maybe they're obviously in season that time of the year. Or pachile anavim, or like bunches of grapes, v'toroshel shibolin, and some sort of like decorative, like shibolin are like great, like the ears, wheat, like made into things, like woven things made out of wheat, etc. Yenos shemanim visiltos, or like containers full of wine and oil and fine flour. Says the Gemara, aso liftapek mehen. It's forbidden to use and make use of any of these things. Carry turn over. Ad motzi yom tova achron shel chag, until after the last day, the end of the last day of Sukkot. Why? Because they're muksa. Yeah, they are. We have a halacha which is noi sukkah muksa, that any decorations you have in the sukkah, since they were huksa lemisvasos, and they were set aside for that purpose on erev sukkahs, they remain muksa for the whole of sukkahs. Says and therefore we see from that Gemara that anything decorative, even if it's makabel tumah, doesn't make the sukkah possible. They're considered to be purely decorations. And the Gemara says, and if you were to make a condition over them, then everything according to condition. So, if you just put up decorations before sukkahs, those decorations, so if for example you hang fruit in your sukkah, I always remember years ago, I won't say what this was, a certain shul, towards the end of sukkahs, they wanted to, for the final days of sukkahs, they wanted to make kiddush, they wanted to use any of the fruit that had been hanging in the sukkah, they wanted to take it down and then cut it up and put it out. And every year I have to tell them, you can't do that. You can't do it, because it remains muksa of the whole of sukkahs. Unless you make a condition before sukkahs and say, any of these things which I'm putting up here can be used during sukkahs. Yeah? Kugon says, look at Rashi, top left-hand corner. Kugon, ta'ama eini budel mehen. Kol bein ha'ashmashas shel yom to harishon. Yeah, I'm not being mavdel them. I'm not setting them aside purely as decorative things, that they have this holiness upon themselves. And therefore, whatever you made that Tanai over, you can use. So we see from that mission, from that Gemara, that decorations, although they are muksa, there's no reason there's no issue, there's no concern that they in any way possible the schach. So Gemara just goes on a tiny bit longer, a bit more. He says, says the Gemara, Dilma minat sat. Idma noi sukkah. Perhaps what we mean is, or what that Gemara there was talking about, was when the sheet or any of these decorations are at the sides. They're on the walls of the sukkah. The Tafano says Rashi, Kama, aval eimelach afilu lineosanami mischach mekabel tumu karele. Perhaps that Gemara was saying that any decorations that are on the walls of the sukkah are absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with those. We haven't an issue with anything which is tamei or makabel tumah on the sides of the sukkah. However, perhaps anything which is hung from the schach, if it's makabel tumah, even if it's there for decorative purposes, it would posel the schach. Perhaps that's what that Gemara says. Perhaps that's not a support for what Rav Chapper is saying here. So says the Gemara, Uminat Sad Ma'atzim. Sorry. Sorry. No, it's okay. Ein Ma'atzim b'sukkah. And it doesn't limit, and it doesn't make the sukkah any smaller. Let's have a look. Yeah, I see. Yeah, what was it? Ein Ma'atzim b'sukkah, says Rashi, Ein Ma'atzim b'sukkah. Kramim ha'persmim lemala lenoi ein Ma'atzim b'gvoha me'esrim. What happens if you've got a sukkah? We said the minimum height of a sukkah is 10 tefachim. What happens if you've got a sukkah which is just about 10 tefachim? The schach is at the 10 tefachim mark. And then you've got decorations hanging down from that, which hang lower than 10 tefachim. Does that posel the sukkah? Here the Gemara says no. Any decoration, anything hanging down from once you've got the schach at 10 tefachim high, anything hanging down lower than that does not posel it. Whereas, so from the top it doesn't posel it, but from the side of minat sad, ma'atzim. From the side it does. So, for example, we said the minimum dimensions of a sukkah are 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim. Any smaller than that, we said, would be too uncomfortable for anyone to be in. Too small, you couldn't get your head, your body, half of your table in there. So what happens if you've got a sukkah which is just about 7 by 7, and then you decorate the walls of the sukkah by you've heard of false ceilings, you put in false walls, right? By putting all these gatherings, warnings, whatever it is. In that case, you do reduce the size of the sukkah, and you would run into problems if it ends up being less than 7 tefachim. So interestingly, because, and obviously obvious reasons, because you made it, we said 7 is the minimum the person can be just about comfortable in it. Any less than that, you're not going to be comfortable. So even though the walls are at 7, if there are some internal decorations in there, even though they're decorative and not actually acting as walls, since they limit the airspace in there, it would posel the sukkah. Okay, we'll leave it there. But tonight, the Gemara is then going to talk about a case of decorations and these different things within the sukkah, to delve a little bit deeper into this idea.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
Have we discussed the shape of the sukkah roof? Because if a tent, if you're allowed a canopy at an angle, does that mean you can also have a sukkah roof that's triangular kind of?
Yeah, no, we talked about that. We talked about this idea about a sukkah. Remember, we said about a sukkah up against a wall.
That's just got the one that's just at an angle.
Yeah. The issue with that is that the roof is acting as the wall and not as the roof. Similarly, you've got the shape of a tent. Again, also you've got to have a minimum of a tefach acting as the schach. And if it's at that apex like that, it's not a tefach, and then you've got problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
And secondly, so if you're hanging decorations, even if it's fruit, there's no restriction on the material that's allowed to hang from the schach.
100%. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So you've got to put metal nails through a banana and then tie it up with a bit of wire to the schach.
Yeah. For example, you can use like those. You never see them like a greengrocers, like they have like those 2-sided hooks. So it's like an S shape.
Yeah.
A hook at one end, hook at the other end. One hook's onto the I don't know, like the
wood or the scarf
shelf.
or whatever. Yeah.
And then the other one actually is into the fruit. 100%. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And any decorations you can use make made of any synthetic material whatsoever. Not an issue whatsoever. So once you've got the kosher schach, then we paskin like the decorations do not posel the schach. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Shkoyach, everyone have a good week.